I should have believed my enemy when he sent me a photo of my wife with another man. Back then, I trusted her so much, never suspecting that she could be involved in something so outrageous, something beyond comprehension. This is not your typical story of betrayal. This is a story that's hard to believe without evidence. A story I never would have believed if it had happened to one of my friends. It's a story about how far a person can go to achieve their goals, even if it means potentially destroying their marriage. It's a story about crime and scams, a tangled tale where you don't know whether to forgive her or throw her out of the house. And today, I'm finally ready to share it. So, my name is Daniel, and my wife's name is Elena. We've been married for 6 years. To me, she was my everything. A bright, ambitious woman who had this magnetic charm. She had this laugh that could fill a room and a presence that made strangers gravitate toward her. I wasn't immune to her pull either. She made you feel like you were the most important person in the world, and I fell for her hard. But as I later discovered, that same charm was a weapon. Ours wasn't a perfect marriage. We had our share of struggles, most of them centered on money or our inability to conceive. I worked in finance, a stable but demanding job, while Elena tried to launch her own event planning business. It started as a passion project, something she could call her own, but soon it became an obsession. Late nights, secretive phone calls, expenses that didn't add up. I chalked it up to the stress of building a business and tried to support her. In hindsight, the cracks were there long before that photo. I just didn't want to see them. The photo arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday morning. I was in my office, half distracted by emails, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an old colleague, no, an old enemy. His name was Anthony, a man I'd clashed with years ago over a failed investment deal. We hadn't spoken since, so I hesitated before opening the message. What I saw made my stomach twist. The photo was simple but damning. Elena, seated at a cafe, leaning in toward a man I didn't recognize. Her hand rested lightly on his wrist, and her expression was intimate. Too intimate. The caption below read, "Thought you should know." I stared at the screen, the words blurring as my mind raced. I wanted to dismiss it as a prank, a petty attempt by Anthony to get under my skin. But something about the image, it felt real. Too real. There was a logo in the background, a small cafe we'd visited once years ago. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a cruel joke. And so, 2 days later, I found myself standing outside that cafe, wondering if my life was about to change forever. Heart pounding in my chest. The sign was unmistakable. A hand-drawn coffee cup with steam curling into the shape of a heart. Elena and I had been here once, years ago, on a lazy Sunday afternoon. It had been her suggestion. A cozy spot she said she'd stumbled across while shopping. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. Now, I wasn't so sure. I felt like a man walking into a trap, but I had to know. I crossed the street, pushed open the door, and was greeted by the low hum of conversations and the sharp scent of freshly brewed coffee. I scanned the room quickly, my breath hitching when I spotted her.
Elena.
She was seated at a small table near the window, her profile illuminated by the soft afternoon light. But it wasn't just her that caught my attention. It was the man sitting across from her. He wasn't the man from the photo. This one was older, clean-shaven, with a well-tailored suit and an expensive watch that glinted in the sunlight. He leaned in toward her, speaking with an intensity that made her smile. Not her polite smile, the one she used on strangers, but the smile she used to reserve for me, warm, inviting, a little mischievous. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they'd been cemented to the floor. Elena reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. It was a fleeting gesture, almost imperceptible, but it hit me like a gut punch. I wanted to burst in, to demand answers, to shout her name and force her to explain herself right there and then. But something stopped me. Instead, I stepped back, retreating into the shadows of the cafe. I stood there for a moment, my mind spinning, my pulse pounding in my ears. Who was this man? And why wasn't it the same one from the photo? I slipped out the door before she could see me, stepping back onto the street and gulping in the crisp air. My hands were trembling, and I shoved them into my pockets, trying to steady myself. Couldn't go home. Not yet. I needed to think. I wandered aimlessly for hours, replaying the scene in my head over and over again. Questions churned in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Was this new man just another piece of the puzzle? How long had this been going on? And what else had I missed? That night, I sat alone in my office with the lights off, staring at the photo on my phone. The photo that had started all of this. The photo that, somehow, seemed like only the tip of the iceberg. I'd walked into the cafe hoping for clarity, but all I'd found were more questions. And for the first time, I began to feel like the life I thought I knew was slipping through my fingers. That night, when Elena walked through the door, I barely looked up. She greeted me with her usual warmth, but the image of her at the cafe, leaning toward that man, smiling like she used to at me, refused to leave my mind. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Work." "Yeah," I muttered, avoiding her eyes. I started pulling away after that. Conversations became curt, her touch felt foreign, and I stopped trying to bridge the growing gap. She noticed quickly. "Daniel, talk to me," she said one evening, her voice unsteady. "You're different. Is it something I did?" I wanted to shout the truth at her, demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. "It's not you," I lied. Her unease grew with my silence. She started watching me like I was the stranger, but the truth was, I no longer knew who she was either. Each night, lying beside her, I replayed the scene from the cafe in my mind. The trust we'd built over 6 years crumbled in the shadows, piece by piece, until I began to wonder if I'd ever really known her at all. I couldn't keep drowning in questions with no answers. I needed clarity, but I wasn't ready to confront Elena directly. Not yet. Instead, I called the one person I trusted to help me make sense of the mess. My oldest friend, Mark. Mark had always been my anchor, the calm voice of reason when emotions threatened to overtake me. He listened quietly as I told him everything. The photo, the cafe, the man, and my growing suspicion that there was more I hadn't uncovered. "You're not crazy for thinking something's off," he said, after a long pause. "But if you're not ready to confront her, we need a plan to get answers." That's how we devised it. Mark would start frequenting the cafe, blending in as just another regular. Elena didn't know him beyond the occasional mention, so she wouldn't recognize him. His job was simple. Observe her, her patterns, and the people she met. For the next few days, Mark became my eyes and ears. Each evening, he'd send me updates. At first, there was nothing. Elena didn't show up. But on the 4th day, she did. "She's here," Mark texted, followed by a description that made my stomach churn. A blonde wig, oversized sunglasses, and a casual dress I hadn't seen her wear before. She wasn't alone either. "She's sitting with a man," Mark continued. "Not the one you mentioned. This guy's younger." The messages kept coming. She laughed easily, leaned in close, and touched his hand more than once. It was the same pattern I'd seen before, but now it felt calculated. Deliberate. "She's doing this often," Mark told me later, his voice low. "Different men, same place, same act. Something's going on here, and it's not just an affair." As his words sank in, I realized this wasn't just about betrayal. It was bigger, darker, and far more twisted than I had imagined. Mark's reports grew stranger by the day. Elena wasn't just meeting men. She was transforming for them. Wigs, oversized sunglasses, different outfits. Each time, she became someone new. "She's playing a role," Mark said. "She's not just cheating. It's like she's crafting a new identity for every guy." One evening, Mark took a calculated risk and struck up a conversation with her. Using the live listening feature on AirPods, I listened in from my office as my friend played the part of a curious stranger. Elena's voice came through, cheerful and flirtatious, the tone she used to reserve for me. She introduced herself as Maya and spun a tale of being a freelance writer who loved meeting new people. The way she laughed, teased, and leaned into her story made my skin crawl. I'd fallen for that charm once, and now I was hearing her use it like a tool on someone she thought was just another Mark. By the time the conversation ended, she had given Mark her number and hinted at meeting again. My stomach turned as I listened to her sign off with a coy, "I'm always looking for interesting people." The next day, Elena texted Mark, arranging a meetup at the cafe. He went, and through my AirPods, I listened as she pitched him an innocent story. She told him she was working on a piece about local hotels and needed someone to tag along to get an honest male perspective. Mark played along, feigning interest, even as both of us knew this wasn't about writing or research. Later that evening, they arrived at a modest but private hotel on the edge of town. Mark kept me updated via quick texts as they went inside. Moments after they entered the room, Elena excused herself, leaving Mark alone. And then the chaos began. A man burst into the room, slamming the door behind him. He was tall, angry, and shouting, his voice echoing through Mark's AirPods as I listened helplessly from miles away. "That's my wife," the man yelled, his words laced with rage. "What the hell are you doing with her?" Mark played his part perfectly, stammering apologies, pretending to be blindsided. The man grabbed him by the shirt, threatening to call the police and expose him unless he paid for his silence. Elena re-entered the room, her face a perfect picture of distress. She begged the man to calm down, but it was clear she was part of the act. Mark managed to stall, insisting he didn't have his wallet. Meanwhile, I was already racing to my car. The scam had been laid bare. Elena and this man weren't just conning strangers, they were partners in crime, and I wasn't about to let them get away with it. I reached the hotel in record time, my heart racing as I imagined what I'd find. Elena's voice and the scammer's threats echoed in my mind, filling me with equal parts fury and disbelief. As I stormed down the hallway toward the room number Mark had texted me, I could hear muffled voices inside. The man's booming anger, Elena's frantic pleas, and Mark's nervous responses. They all became clearer with each step. I didn't knock. I kicked the door open. The scene froze as I stepped inside. The man, mid-yell, turned to face me, his grip still tight on Mark's shirt. Elena's face drained of color, her eyes wide in shock. Mark, playing his part to the end, let out a feigned gasp of relief. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. The man dropped Mark like a sack of bricks, stumbling over his words as he tried to maintain the act. "Who are you? This is none of your business. I'm her real husband," I spat, glaring at Elena. "And I think it's time we all got honest." Chaos erupted. The man lunged toward me, but Mark intercepted him, shoving him against the wall. Elena's carefully crafted facade cracked completely as she began stammering explanations, her polished words now a mess of desperation. "Daniel, it's not what you think," she cried, her voice trembling. "I can explain. Just let me explain." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Not what I think. You're running a scam with this clown, Elena. What exactly do you think I don't understand?" The man tried to protest, but Mark tightened his grip on him. "You stay quiet," Mark growled. Elena broke under the weight of it all, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't have a choice," she sobbed. "We needed the money, Daniel. I didn't know what else to do. It was for us, for IVF." Her words hit me like a blow. For a brief moment, the anger faltered, replaced by something colder, disbelief. "For IVF?" I repeated, my voice low. "This is how you justify it? Scamming strangers, humiliating yourself? Lying to me?" Elena reached out, but I stepped back. "I didn't know how to tell you," she pleaded. "We needed the money, and this just happened. But I never," her voice broke. "I never slept with them, Daniel. I swear. It was just a con. I only wanted to help us." I stared at her, my mind reeling. Was this woman, the one I had loved, trusted, and built a life with, truly trying to sell me this excuse? Mark released the scammer, who stumbled toward the door. "You're done," Mark said coldly, his hand still clenched into a fist. "You have no idea what you've just done," the man sneered, but neither of us cared. He disappeared into the hallway, leaving only the wreckage of Elena's lies behind him. I turned back to her, shaking my head. "I trusted you," I said quietly. "And this is what you do?" Elena sank to the floor, her face buried in her hands. But I felt nothing but the weight of her betrayal. And at that moment, I knew there was no going back. The silence in the car on the drive home was suffocating. Elena sat beside me, staring out the window, her tear-streaked face pale. She tried once to speak, but I cut her off, my voice colder than I'd ever thought it could be. "Don't. Not another word." When we arrived, I handed her a duffel bag and told her to pack. "You're leaving tonight," I said, my tone final. She didn't argue, her hands trembling as she stuffed a few essentials into the bag. As I watched her, I felt a strange mix of fury and sorrow. The woman I'd loved, the one I thought I'd known better than anyone, had unraveled into a stranger. A liar, a con artist, and worse. She paused by the door, looking at me with swollen, pleading eyes. "Daniel, I know I can't fix this, but I love you. Please don't give up on us." Couldn't even respond. The door clicked shut behind her, and for the first time in years, I was alone. The separation process began immediately. I called a lawyer the next day, refusing to waste any more time. Elena sent me messages. Long, rambling texts apologizing, explaining, begging, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. Weeks passed. The legal wheels turned, and I started to believe I was finally free of her. Then one night, just as I was settling into the uneasy rhythm of my new life, she showed up at my door. I opened it to find her standing there, looking fragile but determined. Her hands rested protectively on her stomach. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice trembling. "And it's yours." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words hung between us, heavy and impossible. "What?" I finally managed, my mind racing. "It's your baby," she repeated. "I found out a few weeks ago. Daniel, I swear, I'm telling the truth." I wanted to laugh, to shout, to slam the door in her face. Instead, I stood frozen, staring at the woman who had shattered my life as she now claimed to be carrying my child. "I don't believe you," I said finally, my voice sharp. "Not after everything." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. "Please, Daniel, at least let me prove it. This baby is ours." I didn't know what to say. The rage and confusion churned inside me, clashing with something I didn't want to admit. Hope. Elena's claim of pregnancy gnawed at me, leaving me restless and suspicious. She said the child was mine, but how could I trust anything she said? Her betrayal had already shown me the depth of her lies. I needed answers. I hired a private investigator, someone discreet but thorough. His task was simple: dig into Elena's life, her associates, her movements, her secrets. If she was lying about the baby, I had to know. It didn't take long. "She's been involved with someone," the investigator told me during our second meeting. "A man named Caleb. He's part of her scam group." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos of Elena with Caleb at cafes, at hotels, and even entering an apartment together. My stomach turned as I studied the images. Unlike the strangers she conned, Caleb wasn't a target. He was familiar with her world, part of it. But the most damning piece of evidence was an email the investigator had uncovered, where Caleb referred to Elena as "my love" and mentioned starting fresh somewhere else. When I confronted Elena with the evidence, she didn't deny it. Instead, she broke down, her hands trembling as she sat across from me. "Caleb was a mistake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't serious. I didn't know how to stop." "Not serious?" I snapped, slamming the folder down on the table. "You lied to me. You scammed strangers. And now this? Was the baby part of your mistake too?" Her silence was deafening. She wouldn't meet my eyes, her tears falling freely. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice breaking. "It's possible, Daniel, but I swear it could be yours. I just don't know." Her words hit me like a hammer. My trust, already shattered, now felt irreparable. I couldn't decide what stung more, the betrayal or the slim possibility that the child could be mine. "You've destroyed everything," I said coldly, standing up. "Don't expect me to fix it." As I left her there, broken and crying, I knew there was no going back. If the baby was mine, I'd face that truth eventually. But any chance of saving what we'd once had was gone. Elena's pleas came almost daily after our last confrontation. Calls, texts, emails, all filled with the same desperate refrain. I didn't have a choice. "Please, Daniel, let me explain." I ignored most of them, but when she showed up at my door again, disheveled and trembling, I let her inside. Part of me hated myself for still caring. She sat on the couch, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. Her voice shook as she began. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she said, her words tumbling out. "The scams, Caleb. None of it was what I wanted. I was manipulated, Daniel. They coerced me." I folded my arms, keeping my distance. "You expect me to believe that?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she pressed on. "At first it was just one job. They promised it would be quick, easy money. But then Caleb started pressuring me to do more. He said we needed the cash if we ever wanted to." She stopped, her voice breaking. "If we ever wanted to try IVF." I felt trapped. Her words stirred something in me, a flicker of the woman I used to know, the woman who dreamed of a family with me. But even as she spoke, I couldn't shake the image of her in that hotel room, playing her part in the scam, lying without hesitation. "I swear, I never loved him," she continued, her voice cracking. "It was all an act. I didn't know how to get out, Daniel. I was scared. And now I'm pregnant, and I don't know what to do." Her hands reached for mine, but I pulled away, the weight of her deceit crushing me. "You were scared," I asked bitterly. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us? You lied to my face for months. Years, maybe. And now you want me to believe you were the victim." Her tears spilled over as she shook her head. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know I ruined everything. But I love you. I always have. Please, just give me a chance to make this right." Her words hung in the air, a tangled mix of sincerity and manipulation. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the woman I'd loved still existed beneath the lies. But how could I? That night, after she left, I sat alone, staring at the documents the private investigator had given me. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet my heart refused to let go completely. She said she loved me. She said she was desperate. But I couldn't tell if her promises were real or just another con. The breaking point came when I learned the full truth. Elena hadn't just kissed her victims or flirted her way through the scams. She had slept with several of them. The IVF excuse, which once seemed desperate but plausible, unraveled completely under the weight of her actions. It wasn't about family. It wasn't about us. It was about greed, manipulation, and lies. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it this time. Instead, she folded her arms, her expression defiant. "What do you want me to say, Daniel? That I regret it? Fine, I regret it. But you weren't exactly around, were you?" Her words were like acid. She wasn't sorry. She was just angry that she'd been caught. That was when I knew. There was no saving her, no salvaging what was left of us. But I couldn't let her walk away unscathed. Not after everything she'd done. Not to me, not to the other victims who had unknowingly been pulled into her schemes. I gathered everything I had. The photos, the emails, the recordings from Mark's AirPods. Every shred of evidence I'd accumulated in the weeks since I'd learned the truth. And I went to the police. At first, the detective assigned to the case seemed skeptical. "So, your wife's part of a scam ring?" he asked, flipping through the folder I'd handed him. "She's not just part of it," I said coldly. "She's at the center of it. And I can prove it." The detective leaned forward as I laid out the entire operation. The cafe meetups, the fake personas, the hotel cons. Mark provided his testimony, recounting his staged encounter with Elena and her accomplice. It was enough to spark an investigation. Over the next few weeks, I worked closely with law enforcement, feeding them everything I knew. They tracked her movements, identified Caleb and other members of the scam group, and began building their case. Elena must have sensed something was wrong. She called me repeatedly, her messages swinging between angry outbursts and tearful apologies. "Why are you doing this to me?" she screamed in one voicemail. "I loved you, Daniel. I still love you." But her words held no power over me anymore. The arrests came swiftly, a coordinated effort that dismantled the entire operation in a single night. Elena, Caleb, and 2 others were taken into custody. When I saw her mugshot in the news the next morning, I felt nothing.
No satisfaction.
No triumph. Just a cold, empty sense of closure. Elena's lawyer tried to reach me, begging for my cooperation. "She's willing to cut a deal," he said. "She'll testify against Caleb if you can." "I'm done," I interrupted. "Tell her to find someone else to save her this time." As the case moved forward, I stepped back. I didn't need to see the details play out in court. I'd done my part. And I knew Elena would face the consequences of her choices, whether she regretted them or not. In the end, exposing the scam ring wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my sense of justice. Elena had destroyed so much, but I refused to let her destroy me. The final meeting took place in a small, sterile room at the detention center. I hadn't planned to see Elena again, but her lawyer had convinced me it was necessary for closure. What closure could I possibly need from a woman who had burned our life to the ground? When I entered, she was already seated, her hands clasped tightly on the table, her eyes red and hollow. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of her lies had finally crushed the vibrant woman I'd once loved. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I wasn't sure you would." I said nothing, sitting across from her with a blank expression. The silence stretched, and she squirmed under the weight of it before finally speaking. "Daniel, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Everything I did, I thought I was helping us, helping our future." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Helping us? By conning strangers, sleeping with them, lying to me for years? Tell me, Elena, which part of that was supposed to help?" Her tears came quickly then, spilling over as she buried her face in her hands. "I was desperate," she whispered. "I made mistakes, horrible mistakes, but I never meant to hurt you. And yet you did," I said, my voice cold. "You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed us. You destroyed everything we were supposed to be." She reached out, her hand trembling on the table between us. "The baby, Daniel. He's innocent in all of this. I need you to be there for him, even if you can't forgive me." Her words stopped me. I looked at her hand, then into her eyes, searching for some fragment of the woman I'd loved. She was right about one thing: the baby was innocent. "I'll be there for him," I said finally, my voice steady. "But not for you. Whatever bond we had, Elena, you killed it. And I'm not going to let your mess drag me down any further." Her sobs filled the room, but I stood and walked out without looking back. The months that followed were far from easy. The legal proceedings dragged on, and I became a single father almost overnight. But I threw myself into it, determined to give my son the love and stability he deserved. There were nights when the anger returned, clawing at me as I lay awake. But each time, I reminded myself that I was no longer bound by Elena's lies. I had survived her betrayal, exposed her crimes, and emerged stronger on the other side. One day, as I watched my son sleep in his crib, his tiny hand curled into a fist, I realized something. I wasn't broken anymore. Scarred, yes, but not broken. And those scars would remind me of the lessons I'd learned, the most important of which was this: trust is earned, not given blindly.